Welcome back to the Cat Dad Show. My name is Scott Colby. Now, if you've lost a pet, this episode is for you. Today, we're going to be talking all about what to do for pet loss and pet grief with psychic medium and grief coach Deva Neely. We're going to be chatting about how death is not final and how we are forever connected to those we lose in the physical world. Deva, welcome to the Cat Dad Show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Thanks you for being here. So let's just jump right in. People
All
don't
right.
they don't want to know about us. They want to know how we can help them. So what's the one thing you want every pet parent to know about the connection we have with our pets, even after they've passed?
Well, here's what I know to be true. And I never try to impose my views on other people. I let people know what it is, the messages that I receive, and they can do with that information what they like. But what I know about death, and whether that's people, whether that's pets, is they never truly leave us. They are always there with us. Death is not a finality. So what happens is we shed our physical vessel and our spirit lives on. Our spirit is eternal. And I know there are some people of the belief that animals don't have souls, but I am not of that belief. I have never been of that belief, and I looked for confirmation otherwise. And I had a really interesting guest on my podcast who specializes in that. And she said they most definitely do have souls. Sorry.
No worries. And what kind of confirmation do you get?
Well, the thing is that to me, it never made sense when people said, oh, animals don't have souls, because every animal has a different personality. Every animal has different baggage and grow according to their life experiences. And how do you explain that? If they don't have a soul, then how can we have a personality? Because I think our personality is based in our soul essence, and we feel these connections to our animals. And oftentimes, and when you speak to pet owners, and I'm sure you can attest to this, it feels like the pets pick you. You didn't choose the pet. And so I truly believe that there is a spirit connection. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I talk about when I got my dog, I went to a breeder. Not that I condone that. If I have a dog in the future or like get another dog, I will go to a shelter. But I went to a breeder because I was curious about the breed. And so I went purposely to see the dog, see the temperament, sort of, you know, feel my way around that breed. And I picked each one of them up. There were 3 of them. And when I picked Hugo up, he nuzzled under my chin. He looked me in the eyes, like, and it felt like for a long time, like it looked like he was trying to assess me. And then he licked my nose. And I sort of felt like, oh, he chose me. He said, yes, please. And I said, who do I write the check to? And he came home with me that day. That was not my intention. And I was not
It never
ready.
is. It never is.
No. On the drive home, there was a stop at a pet supply store to get everything I needed because I was not prepared. So I truly believe that there is a soul in all those animals, and we need to treat them accordingly. We need to treat them with respect. And, you know, people, of course, bring up the whole concept of vegetarianism or veganism. And that's a tough one to talk about. And I don't know if that's something you've talked about on your show. But I think in essence, more than anything, more than whether we eat meat or not, we have to be respectful that it is another soul. It is another being, and treat it as such. So when we lose them, we do it. It's the same sort of grief when we lose a human as well.
Yeah, and I know you've had your own personal journey with grief, which led you to rediscover your psychic abilities. Can you share a bit about how your brother played a role in this?
Yeah. So just to precursor this story, so everybody knows my brother was a bit of a jackass, and I loved him dearly, but we fought severely. And we had one of those relationships where we were really protective of each other, but we didn't lay off each other either. We were each other's toughest critics, and so that just foreshadows kind of what's coming. Um, but what ended up happening is I got the news on May 19th, 2013, that my brother died by suicide.
Mm,
And
sorry.
it pulled the rug out from under me. My world stopped in that moment. And nothing looked the same. And nothing ever went back to the same. And at the time, I thought that that was very bad, but I'm actually very grateful now that it didn't go back to what it was. So it did take me on a very long journey through grief, trying to process that kind of traumatic loss, trying to get answers to questions that I just couldn't get answers to, and having to be okay with that. And so I went to a very dark place. I got diagnosed with PTSD and severe anxiety, and I ended up suffering many traumas thereafter because as everybody was dealing with their grief, what do people do? They lash out at other people. I was the scapegoat for that. So I lost the majority of my family, most of my aunts and uncles and my grandmother at that point. And I felt like I lost everything, and I ended up losing my career. I was a teacher working in a classroom at a school, and I had to take a leave because of, drama that was happening there as well. And recognizing at the time that I was working in a very toxic environment, it's kind of like all these things happened at once. And I thought I wasn't going to survive it. I spent the good part of 7 years just trying to stay alive, dealing with suicidal ideation and, just trying to get out of bed every day. And sometimes that was hard, and sometimes I didn't. So what ended up happening is I made a decision. I was living in Toronto, so I was living in a metropolitan city, and I decided to go back to my hometown, which is a very small town in southern Ontario. And it's where my brother and I grew up. And it was always a place I had said I would go back to. And it was probably one of the best decisions I made for myself. I felt more connected to my brother. I started remembering things as children growing up. Like, there was a lot of things that helped me in that healing process. And what ended up happening is a paradigm shift, because I was part of support groups and trauma groups. And in one of the support groups I was in, this woman asked a question: how long have y'all been dealing with PTSD? And I was skimming the answers, and this one woman's answer stood out to me. She said 43 years and counting.
Mm,
And I thought in that moment, that cannot be my story. I will not survive that. And so I made a decision in that moment to do anything and everything I could to heal. And I did. That's exactly what I did. And I don't know if it's the mindset shift that worked, or if it was just me trying literally everything to see what stuck. But I think in doing so, it forced me inwards. I was doing meditation, I was doing yoga, I was doing all these things that were very introspective, that was forcing me to look inwards. And in that process, I started connecting to spirit again and remembering as a child my connection with spirit. Because as a child, I used to see ghosts. I used to see them. I used to talk to them as though they were in the room, like me seeing you or anybody else in the room with me. They were there. And so I spent my entire childhood dealing with spirits everywhere, but not knowing how to communicate that to the living who were around me as well. And so at 4 years old, I was explaining to my mom quantum physics and how this girl up in my playroom looked just like me, and we were living in alternate realities. So my mom just thought I had an imaginary friend. Well, and what would a mom do if your 4-year-old came and told you that?
yeah.
Right. So, all these things came flooding back, and my brother started speaking to me. And at first, I thought it was my imagination. I thought it was more of a desire. It wasn't really him. But remember when I said at the beginning, my brother was a jackass?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he was doing it again. So every night, on a regular basis, every night, he would come to me in that place where I wasn't quite asleep, but I wasn't fully awake. And he would shout my name in my ear, and it would startle me awake. And I would just pass it off as nothing, or, I was dreaming or whatever. Until it happened so much, I thought, okay, I can't ignore this. And it was almost like I could hear him saying, "Oh my God, finally, you stubborn." Like, he was just so frustrated because he was yelling at me, "Deva," right? Trying to get my attention. And so I started talking back to him, and it started our reconnection and reestablishing that connection. And then he introduced me to more of them. And, all of that started coming back. And the more I started just leaning into it, it all came flooding back.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. And sorry for your loss, but it sounds like your gift was reignited into something beautiful. And, I know, I don't know much about psychic mediums, and I know some people are skeptical. I actually posted in a pet loss grief support group on Facebook that I was going to be interviewing you, and somebody said psychic mediums are a scam. And well, how do you maybe explain to somebody that's skeptical? Obviously, we may not be able to change people's minds, but how would you at least explain your gift to other people that may be skeptical about this?
That's a really good question. And it's not the first time I've heard it. And nor is it the first time I've heard somebody calling it a scam, or calling me a witch, or that I'm doing devil's work, all kinds of things. And here's my answer. It's not up to me to convince you, right? It's not my job. All I can do is relay the messages that I receive, and you do with that as you wish. I can't change free will. I can only tell you what spirit is telling me. And a lot of times that is confirmation enough that people start to go, oh. And for me, the biggest victory was my stepfather, because he was a big skeptic. He did not believe in ghosts even. And I told him very frequently that my stepbrother, his son, was always at the house. He was always there. And he kind of passed it off. And I even pointed things out. And out of the blue one day, he said, "Would you do a reading for me?" He's like, "I'd like to talk to my mom." And I was shocked that he was open to it. And I said, "Well, I can try. I can never guarantee." And so I did a reading, and his mom and his sister came through, and he ended up in tears. And he said to my mom afterwards, he's like, "There are things she said that she would not have known." He said nobody knew. And I didn't know his sister. I never met her. She died way before he had come into our lives. So I just gave him the messages that I received. That is the confirmation that I can give. But if you're not open to it, I'm not going to fight you for it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. You almost have to experience it if you're kind of skeptical at first. But skepticism, I think, can be healthy. But like you mentioned, you have to be open to just learning more about it. That's what I'm here doing, as well as the listeners. We're learning, and we can take your information and maybe experience it, or maybe just process it and come to our own conclusions. It's kind of how I view things. For those of us who have lost a beloved pet, how can we kind of start reestablishing a relationship with them on a spiritual level?
Well, I think, and again, this advice goes to anybody we've lost, not just a pet, is just acknowledge them. They want to be acknowledged. They want to know that you still hold a place for them. And we often are misguided in thinking of them in the past, but they're really in the present. And so have a conversation with them, or if you feel their presence, acknowledge it. They get excited. And the one thing I've found frequently in the readings that I've done for people is pets are the first one, or of amongst the first spirits meeting their loved ones when they pass. And it's such a beautiful message to relay. And I'm not a psychic medium that gets a lot of hits from animals, but it has happened.
Mhm.
And it's very profound for me because it's not a usual thing. There are people very specifically who only do pet mediumship, which I think is fascinating. So when I'm able to relay, I'm like, did you have a family dog? Because, I'm being shown that there was a dog upon the transition of your mother, your father, grandmother, whatever. And 100% of the time, there was this, beloved family pet. And so it was of no surprise to them that the pet would be greeting that person as they transition. So talk to them. And when you feel them, trust your instincts and knowing that they're around. They keep an eye on us.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I think I've been doing the same thing. I lost two cats. One was 5 years ago, one was a little over a year ago.
Mhm.
And I've been, initially it's tough. That grief is just overwhelming. It knocks you down. Everybody, of course, processes it differently. But now I'm kind of in the space, and we'll talk maybe about the ways that you can process your grief and what it can look like as time goes by. But
Mhm.
now I feel like I can honor them. I can talk to them. I have two new cats that, they have some personality traits that remind me of them. I'll be like, Nico and Milo are my new cats. I'm like, you would have loved Mia and Nomar. And I'll just say things like that. And yeah, that just makes me feel good to, just think about them in that way.
It's often the case too that they reincarnate,
Mm,
and they reincarnate quickly. And it's very common that when we get a pet after the loss of one, it is the spirit of that pet coming through,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
And we have that instinct, but we're like, nah, that can't be. Trust your instincts. It's actually quite common. And they will let us know in some way that it is them.
I actually have a guest coming up in a few weeks, and we're going to be talking about reincarnation in pets. So I'm
Oh,
super,
amazing.
yeah. So I'm excited about. Look, you had a premonition.
Love
um, but speaking of grief, gosh, I alluded to a pet loss grief support group on Facebook that I'm in. There's thousands of people in there just devastated by
that.
a loss of the pet. I've gone through the grief of the loss of a pet. You've gone through grief of loved ones. It can feel overwhelming. It can feel never ending. I know you've, called it a life sentence. How can we kind of cope with the grief, the loss of a pet, and that feeling of overwhelming, like life will never be the same? How do we move on? What do we do with these feelings that are just kind of knocking us down, and it's hard to get back up sometimes?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing is acknowledgement.
Mm,
And by that, I mean acknowledging that those feelings exist. Sometimes we try to ignore them, or we try to put on a brave face. And I say, why? Why? When we're grieving, we are hurting. It's excruciatingly painful. And yet we're afraid to show that. And I think part of that is fear of judgment from society, because some people don't understand or have not experienced. So they aren't operating at the same level of consciousness. They don't grasp what that must feel like. And so we need to acknowledge those feelings and be compassionate with ourselves, which we have problems doing. We need to be compassionate in assessing what are the things we need in that moment, because we often ignore and just try to suck it up and go to work or suck it up and do our everyday thing, instead of honoring how we're feeling and taking a moment to cry, to allow ourselves to feel. So I always tell my clients, what would you do if you were helping a friend in this position? What would you say to them? And it's actually telling, because sometimes they're like, oh, I would tell them to suck it up, or I would tell them to, you have to go on. And they realize how harsh that may have been had they done that before, or if that is their natural instinct, realizing, well, it's not serving somebody who's in pain right now. Right. And so when we can learn to be compassionate towards ourselves, that's the first step. We need to honor how we're feeling and not ignore it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I, before I lost my 2 cats, and I would see somebody post about losing a pet, like again on social media, and I would, say like a kind message, but I didn't feel it because I hadn't gone through that loss yet myself. And so I didn't know exactly how they felt. Since losing Nomar and Mia, gosh, I feel it so much more deeply when somebody else loses a pet. Sometimes somebody posts that they lost their pet and I tear up, and I've never even met the pet, maybe not even met the person, just the circumstances. And gosh, I can't imagine going through their circumstance because it seems so tragic, and I can really feel that pain that they are feeling. But you're right, just that acknowledgement and being okay with how you're feeling, and it's a personal journey that everybody kind of goes through on a different level, and just allowing yourself to feel what you're feeling and those emotions that can come out from it.
Yeah, and grief ebbs and flows, right? It's not going to be a forever status.
Yeah.
You're not going to be forever in that excruciating pain. It will subside, and you will be able to breathe and function. And then, sometime down the road, it'll wash over you again. And just like you said, hearing even somebody else talk about losing their pet triggers that grief in you again, right? You tear up. And that's called empathy. That's called understanding what somebody else is going through because you've been there. And this is what we lack a lot in society in general, is we choose not to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes to see things from their perspective. Instead, we choose judgment and pointing fingers, right? And I think that's where we get this great divide happening right now in our world. And instead of saying, you know what, I've never lost a pet, but let me think about something that I hold dear to me and what that would do to me if that person died or if I lost that thing.
Yeah.
Right? It goes back to, elementary school when we're taught, how would you feel if this person did that to you?
Yeah. When the grief is so great that maybe we're not thinking straight, let's say, for lack of a better phrase, and we may not understand, especially when we first lose a pet, and we may have never experienced this before, and we can't get out of bed or we can't stop crying. And I know there's people going through that right now. And so maybe it's just hard to think about, oh, I'm processing my grief and this is normal, when we can't even maybe get to that phase in our heads because the grief is so new, the loss is so new. I don't know if as a grief coach here, what do you recommend that maybe we could start with that may just, move the needle a little bit for us?
Do something that fills your soul. Right? Sometimes it can be as simple as get out of bed, brush your hair, make yourself a tea or a coffee, and just sit with that drink and just hold comfort in that simple thing. Right? We tend to think it needs to be these big, elaborate steps we take. But my motto is a step forward is a step forward. It doesn't matter how small it is. Baby steps are still steps.
Yes.
right? And so don't push the gamut. But if you find pleasure in sitting and listening to the ocean, if you live near the ocean, go and sit near the ocean and have a good cry and let that energy of that body of water fill you up. Or listen to ocean sounds if you don't live near the ocean. Whatever it is that you do that brings you an iota of joy. And it's not to say the expectation is for you to be, oh yeah, okay, I'm better now. No,
Right.
it's just bringing something that gives you that space to breathe, because we tend not to breathe. A reminder to breathe, because when we hold our breath is usually when things will erupt, right? We need to breathe through to release the emotions and do something that just gives us some comfort, right? And I think of a tea because that's what I do. I'll get a cup of tea, something hot, and sit with it close to my heart. And it just, you feel that comfort, that warmth, the aroma. It sort of gets all your senses going, right? And be willing to feel what you feel. Acknowledge the feelings.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned get out in nature. And again, everybody is unique. So, what works for one person may not work for another, but that's something that I liked to do when I was grieving initially the loss of my first cat, Nomar, is getting out on a trail in a forest and by a river and just listening to the sounds of the river. And that I feel like that helped me connect with something bigger out there in this universe. And then I actually liked to write letters. I got a journal specifically to write letters to Nomar. I had feelings of guilt, so I was in the letters asking Nomar to forgive me, to remind him how much I loved him, and just those things. Even though I was probably crying, the tears were streaming as I was going through that. I think that release and being out in nature was something that definitely helped me.
100%. Journaling is a great way to process grief, or really process emotions of any kind, right? When we put a pen to paper, it changes the synapses in our brains, where instead of it feeling like you're ruminating on it and it's running around there, it takes this path through us onto the paper. And it's the best way. Doing a brain dump or writing a letter, like you said, is a great way to express your feelings, to let your feelings be known to whomever you've lost. And sometimes we get answers back in that because we're so engrossed. It's a form of mindfulness, right? And when we're doing something that takes us out of our brain and makes us focus on one thing, it opens space to receive those messages from our loved ones, from spirit, from the universe, right? And sometimes we're like, I feel like this is my next step, or I feel like I'm meant to do this. We give ourselves space to allow that to come in. And that's so important. We don't take enough time to just stop and listen. But I love what you said, the idea of journaling. I actually created a grief journal as a free resource for people.
Yes.
It's a 30-day grief journal. And it doesn't have to be like 30 days consecutively. It can be you do one day this day and a couple days later you do another. But it's to walk you through 30 prompts that get you to, like you did, get it out on paper, to think about things differently, to start telling stories again, to start remembering memories, to releasing anger, to, right? There are prompts and there are things that get people to think about things differently. One, for instance, is get pictures out and look at pictures. You're so afraid to look at pictures because you're afraid it's going to bring up those emotions. Well, don't be afraid of those emotions. And
that was
sometimes,
me. That was me. Yeah.
That's a human thing, right?
Yeah.
But when we do bring out those pictures, I can guarantee you'll feel much more love Love will always surpass the grief.
Mm.
And we grieve because we did love so deeply.
Yeah, and you made a great point. It doesn't have to be like you're doing this every single day. That can get overwhelming. I did mine sporadically, and then when it became a year since Nomar passed away, kind of his he passed away in August, so kind of the first year anniversary, I wrote him a letter every day in August of like the next year. So that was kind of my 30 days. But is this easy for you to share the resource with the viewers and listeners here?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think I shared my links with you if
Yeah.
you wanted to put
Okay.
it in the notes.
Yeah.
But it is on my website, which
Okay.
is Stan Store at Deva Neely, or at Grief Relief. Sorry, I had to think about that for a second. It is on my website. So
Okay. Yeah. Perfect. I've got that down. I'll share that in the notes for the viewers and listeners to be able to download that. Thank you for making that resource very helpful.
Everything I do, I think, what could I have used back
mm,
in the time
yeah,
when I was going through it?
I love that. Yes.
Yeah,
You got to work from your own experience, right? Because
exactly.
others are going through the same thing.
Yeah.
Um, You mentioned that grief changes who we are and forces us to create a new normal. So, how do
Mhm.
you help people navigate this transformation while honoring the memory of their pets or really any loved one that they've lost?
It's acknowledging their existence. It's acknowledging that it is part of your life journey,
Mm,
right? We tend to want to forget. And I know some people in grief refuse to mention that pet or that person again. And what service does that do to you and to them? Right. So it's when we can acknowledge, there's that word again, not just our feelings, but acknowledge their place in our lives, understand that, yep, there is a void now. Physically, they're not in our lives, but this is where I shift people to start making that spiritual connection, to understand that our new normal still has them present in our lives. It just
mm,
looks different.
yeah.
And we learn to reestablish those relationships, communicate differently, feel and trust, and start going inward versus looking for outside validation.
Mm, yeah. My grief journey has been kind of really interesting to watch. I mean, I'm one of those people that are like, I don't know how I'm ever going to live without How am I going to live without them? That's what
Mhm.
I thought when they were still alive. How am I ever going to live without them? And I think that's probably a pretty common thought. And believe me, it was so rough. Now I'm doing things to honor Nomar and Mia, this podcast being one. So
Yeah.
I'd love to it used to be like their memory when it first happened, just tears streaming, pictures, the tears would stream. Now I get an energy when I say, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast in honor of Nomar and Mia," or I'm actually putting together a hike to raise funds for people struggling with their vet bills because I know that's a struggle for people, especially with senior pets. And I'm like, I've created a Nomar and Mia compassion fund, and it really allows me to feel like their spirit lives on and that they would be proud. And this wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for them. I probably wouldn't have these two cats here over, I can't see them, but on the other side of the room, if it wasn't for Nomar and Mia. So just like all these things that I'm doing, I feel like I'm doing in their honor, and it gives me joy. So that's, I feel like, my new normal.
Yes. Well, you've found a purpose. And I
Mm,
think that's where we all have to sort of take a step back and go, okay, this really horrible thing has happened in my life, but everything that happens in our lives is meant as a learning tool, and sometimes that can be hard to swallow, absolutely. But when we start asking the question differently, instead of why did this happen to me, and we ask the question, why did this happen for me?
mm,
Right?
yeah.
And look at your path. Why did it happen for you? It gave you purpose to start a platform, giving people somewhere to go
Mm,
to talk and to acknowledge this grief and what this does for people, and brings like-minded people together, creating a community so that we can support each other, which I think there's strength in that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But you never would have known that had you not experienced the loss of your fur babies.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that you work with people to tap in their own intuitive abilities. Can
Mhm.
anybody learn to communicate with their deceased pets or other loved ones, or is it something that only a few people have the ability to learn?
No, 100% everybody has the ability. We
Okay.
all have intuition, right?
Mm,
Everybody, I think, can think of a time in their life when they would say words like, I knew that was going to happen. I should have trusted my instincts,
yeah.
right? How many times does that happen? I can't think of anybody in my life that has not said that at least once, right? So we all have these intuitive abilities. And here's where I give the analogy: we can all learn piano. We all have the ability to play piano. Some will come to it very naturally, and they will do really well really quickly and not have to put a lot of effort in. And those are the people we want to throttle.
Yeah. Darn those people, because I've
Right?
tried to learn this and I can't.
Exactly, exactly. And this is coming from somebody who taught piano for 25 years.
Okay.
So this is why this analogy works so well for me, right? Because I saw kids who struggled and they loved it, and then their sister would come in and just like, oh, and never practice and like play amazingly. And you just think, oh, the kid that's putting in so much effort isn't getting as far as quickly as the one who could care less. So my point in that is, we can all learn piano. We just all come at it different skill sets. And some will be great at it. Some will struggle at finding what their thing is. But we all have the ability. And the idea is we all have to work at it. It is constantly shifting for me. Just when I think I have a handle on what's happening, something shifts. And I kind of feel like that's my spirit team going, oh, don't get comfy. Don't get comfy, right? Because things will happen, or I'll all of a sudden be dealing with negative entities, which I never wanted to deal with, but I guess it's part and parcel. So you have to be open to it, and you have to be willing to put in the work. Is it hard work? I wouldn't say it's hard, but it's a lot of introspection, and it's a lot of meditating and sitting and listening and trusting. That can be the hardest thing. So can everybody? Absolutely. Will everybody? No.
No. Okay.
Right?
Trusting, and you said that was hard, but us just sitting is hard for some people nowadays to be
That's
able to
exactly
sit
it.
still. Yeah.
Yeah. I have so many clients that will say, I'm looking for signs everywhere and I'm not seeing them. I keep asking. And I'll say, because you need to shut up and listen. There's no nicer way to say that. And they're shocked by that. But when do we take 5 minutes and just sit in silence and breathe and allow those messages to come in, or allow ourselves to open up and see? And sometimes we want it so badly, we have tunnel vision. So we're looking here, but we're not seeing the things that are happening around us.
Mm.
And this is what I mean. We need to be open and trust that those messages will come as they are meant to.
First step is to toss these. It's like,
100%.
oh gosh, every time I sit still and try to listen, like I instinctively reach for my phone. It needs to be out of here. Oh
Yeah.
gosh. Yeah. There's often a lot of fear around death, both for ourselves and our pets. I think just the finality of it. I know I have a little bit of fear, probably, to be honest, around my death. Of course, I did with my pets as well. How can we maybe begin to shift our mindset to see death as going home, as I know your spirit team describes it?
Yeah. That's exactly it. If you can imagine, what is the best feeling in the world? Let's say you've been traveling. You just want to be home in your own bed, right? There's nothing better than that first night's sleep back in your own bed. That's kind of how we view that transition. There's nothing like home. It's where we come from. It's what we know. And so death, again, it's explaining that what we see is just the vessel. It's not who we are. Who we are is internal. That's our spirit. And so that spirit leaves the vessel. It's akin to getting out of the car to go into the house, right? We leave the vessel to go home. And so I understand the fear of death. And I think part of it is we don't talk about it. And I've talked about this on my podcast as well. We speak very openly about the miracle of birth, and we talk about birth and all its forms, and all these wonderful things, and babies being born. But we don't talk about death, and people get very uncomfortable when you do talk about it, right? Like when your parents say, when I die, I would like this, this, this. How many people will jump in and go, we don't need to talk about that. We don't need to worry about that yet, right? People get very uncomfortable. It's
That's
almost
me.
like, right? It's that foreboding of, oh my gosh, we're calling it in. We can't call it in. It's going to happen. And I lost a lot of people after my brother's death because people didn't want to talk about suicide. And it was almost like it was contagious. If we talk about it, it could happen to them. And nope, right? And unfortunately, the opposite is true. When we don't talk about it, we're not preparing ourselves for it. So my goal is to normalize that conversation. Have conversations. What do you want after death? Like after you transition? Does your family know what your desires are and how you want end of life to look for you? Right? Especially as we age, we have to start thinking about it.
Right.
And it's not fair to put those decisions on someone else either. Right? At least express what that is to you, because take your power back. When we don't talk about it, we're giving away our power. So yeah, it is scary to think about it. But death is not final. Death is just the car dying. The essence of the car still lives, right? And we still get out of the car and we still go home. It's just the car that goes away.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we can understand that, and I used to fear death as well. And, since having to talk about it as much as I do, I don't anymore. I don't. I mean, I don't want to die soon. I don't know what may happen. If it were to happen soon, I'm okay with it as well.
Yeah.
I don't want to, right? I still feel I've got things to do in this life, but I understand I'm going home. I'm reuniting with every spirit that I've had connections with, that I connect to still, right? And so very often in the readings that I do for people, it communicates these reunions. There's almost this celebratory feeling when somebody transitions, and it's instant. The moment of transition, there's a feeling of love, of peace, just this overwhelming sense of calm, and just knowing you're home. And I'm saying that from messages that come through to me that I ask to relay to people. And they let me feel it. And it is the most euphoric feeling you could ever imagine. It feels like the biggest hug, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you mentioned, you speak about death more now, so you're probably getting a little bit more comfortable with it. I was just thinking in my head, like, I've experienced, pet loss. I'm talking to you about pet loss grief, right? So I don't want to experience it, but I'm more comfortable verbalizing about it because it's something I have experienced and something now that I see and I talk about more. So I think that would be kind of the analogy for me as well. And we talked a little bit about this, but let's maybe kind of confirm or reconfirm this and give some of the listeners some action steps. But let's say
Yeah.
somebody's just starting their journey of spiritual connection with their departed pet or departed loved one. What are 3 simple steps they can take to begin this spiritual connection journey? 3 simple steps they can take.
So first, trust your instincts.
Okay.
If you feel their presence, you don't need to ask me if that's happening. Trust yourself. Because if you're feeling it, you can confirm better than I can tell you. 2 is shut up and listen. Ask them, what do you have to tell me? Or what do I need to know? Or ask for guidance, right? We tend to think we have no right to that conversation, but absolutely you do. And I explain it to people, the ways we learned prayer, and I say that very reluctantly because of the religious connotation that goes along with it. That's exactly what we're doing, but I think of it a little less formal. It's having a conversation, right? Have a conversation. Tell them exactly the things that you want to say. Sometimes you just need to get it out. It's like you said when you put a pen to paper and you started journaling, right? Sometimes just saying, I love you, I miss you, right? Saying those words out loud, they hear you and know and understand that they hear everything you say, right? And that goes for pets, that goes for people we've lost. Yeah. Right. And they want that acknowledgement, but then you need to shut up and listen and hear what they're saying back to you.
That's the hard part sometimes.
Yes. And then the third thing I think would be to honor yourself. What are things that you need to do for you? Forget everybody else. What will make you feel better on this journey? If creating a memorial for that pet or for a loved one is what makes you feel better, do it. It doesn't matter what anybody else thinks.
Yeah.
Right? This is where we need to put these societal pressures exactly where they need to be, which is on the curb, right? Push them to the side. What do you need right now in this moment? And honor yourself and be honest with yourself.
I've heard some people say that losing a pet has been harder than losing a human loved one. Do you think there's a difference in how we grieve for pets compared to our human loved ones?
I think our grief is akin to the relationship we had with the person we've lost or the pet we've lost. Yeah. Right. And I know, there are people who like to think we one up each other, because for me, when my brother died, the number of people who would say things to me like, yeah, but Brian lost his mom. And I'm like, oh, does his mom trump my brother? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Yeah. Or, everybody was so concerned about my parents because they lost a son. So people didn't ask me how I was. And it's funny, I brought that up in a support group, and this woman who had lost a child to suicide as well, she thanked me. She said, Deva, I didn't even consider what my other kids are going through. She says, I've been so consumed with losing a child that I didn't think about my other children. And so we often get into this game of comparison. There's no comparison. Grief is grief, right? We can feel extreme grief in a divorce or in right, losing a job. There's so many ways that we can feel grief. So we shouldn't be judging somebody based on the grief. They're like, oh, they lost a cat. I'm sorry, I lost my mom. So, I win. Yeah. Oh, it's not about winning, really. There's no winner in this. Right? And the sooner we can start being empathetic and putting ourselves into somebody else's shoes and understanding that really we're all coming from the same place. We're all hurting.
Yeah.
Hurt people hurt people. And so when we can take a step back and we can recognize that we should just be acknowledging we're hurting and we should be supporting each other, then hopefully we can start seeing it differently and acting accordingly.
Yeah. To wrap up, I want to ask you one final question. What's the most powerful message or piece of advice you'd give to somebody who has just lost their beloved pet?
Whew. I would say acknowledge the gratitude in what that pet brought to your life. I know for me, my pets saved my life, literally. So when we can think of the gifts that our pets bestowed on us and hold those gifts as the precious commodity that they are, we can keep those gifts. Those gifts will always be ours, even though the pet is no longer present with us. So it's hard to acknowledge gratitude in grief, especially initially, but think of what that animal did for you. And this is equivalent to people as well.
Mm-hmm.
Here's a question. This is an NLP question for you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a brain twister. So you're going to have to think on this and write it out, because you will literally have to think about it for a while. But answer this question. What wouldn't you have if you didn't have the grief of losing, enter name here? What wouldn't you have if you didn't or hadn't lost name?
Yeah.
Because it shifts how we think of it. Because
we got to get the journal out for that.
Right?
And sit and think about it. Yeah. Oh, gosh, that's powerful. Awesome.
It really is. And once you start getting those answers that will come, it will feel like it flows out of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I love how you brought up gratitude. What is the gratitude you have? What did you get by having the life of your beloved furry friends? And that's an amazing kind of way to think about it, and an amazing kind of way to wrap up this conversation. Deva, I want to acknowledge you and the work that you're doing. Grief is tough. Losing a loved one, whether it's a pet or a human, is tough, and you're doing really amazing things, just helping people through this process. And want to acknowledge you with that, and also appreciate you for being on the Cat Dad Show. Before we sign off, I would love if you could maybe let us know how we can connect with you or just follow your work. So in case there's people that want to kind of keep up with what you're doing.
Yeah, I would love that. Well, you can find me on all the socials. I too have a podcast on YouTube called Good Grief.
I love that name.
Yeah. It sounds a bit like an oxymoron, but I'm trying to bring some positivity to grief, that there is growth in grief. And all the socials under my name, Deva Neely. Okay. You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook.
I love it. Well, make sure to link everything up in the notes here. Again, Deva, it's been a pleasure chatting with you on this important topic, and just wanted to thank you again for being an amazing, wonderful guest. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
You're welcome. Thanks, everybody, for watching and listening. We'll talk to you next time.